just to reflect on all of your fascinating presentations. One of the things that really strikes me is we're talking here about workers and how do we make sure that they benefit from the kind of value that's being created and not be exploited. None of you have really mentioned trade unions as any part of that solution. Is your feeling just that trade unions are a solution for the past and actually they have nothing to offer in this new digital economy? What do you think, Nicola?
What I think, I really believe in trade unions and the role they can play in empowering the workers in the future. In fact, when you study social history, you realize that the workers getting their fair share of the value created by the entire economy was due not mostly to the tax system or the welfare state a bit more, but they really needed the unions bargaining on the ground at the company level, at the industry level, because bargaining based on what's really the way things really work in an industry is far more relevant than implementing rules from the top. So unions, in the US, for instance, unions were powerful for a brief period between 35, which was the Wagner Act, and 47 with the Taft-Hartley Act. But during that brief period, they really settled terms and imposed a way for corporations to treat their workers, which outlasted the power of unions until the 1970s. Today, traditional unions are trapped in the old world. They see, as Jeffrey suggested, the large Fordist corporation as the ultimate way to make workers happy and have a sense of dignity. And because they believe in that paradigm, they refuse to consider the new work forms that are emerging in a more digital economy. It would be compromising for them to advocate for the Uber drivers or other workers in the gig economy. And so what I think is that those workers should organize state-of-the-art using the power of technology and based on their working conditions as of today and not the working conditions of the past of which we can only dream of. We don't really see those new unions rising yet, but I'm sure that if social history teaches us a lesson, it's that sooner or later they'll organize and they'll rise as a powerful force, and they'll find powerful allies among the consumers, which I mentioned, but also among the elected officials and within government, which maybe will enact new rules to assist them in the new balance of power.
Interesting. And Jeffrey, what do you think about this idea that consumers are going to ride to the rescue of workers? Do you buy it?
Well, one can hope, but the $15 an hour wages that Nikolai has talked about is, I think, a powerful force. It is, however, small. I mean, it's been done state by state, city by city, even though a majority of the U.S. population has favored raising the minimum wage for years. The national minimum wage has not moved. I certainly don't believe the national minimum wage is going to move with the new administration and with the Republicans in control of both the House and the Senate. So it is possible maybe to organize consumers, but it's interesting in the chart that Nikolai put up of the rising power of consumers. That is possibly true, but in many industries. I would name airlines, I would name telecommunications, I would name pharmaceuticals, where we have huge problems of price increases. I would name electronics, I would name, we could go down actually a long list of industries. The evidence suggests that economic concentration has grown, that there has been immense consolidation and mergers, which is one of the reasons why both branded pharmaceuticals and generic pharmaceutical prices have gone up, which is one of the reasons why telecommunication companies are not very popular, not only in the US, but almost anywhere in the world, because nobody really has very much choice. We have permitted enormous amounts of consolidation. In the airlines, all you've got to look is, what's it called, IAG, the International Airline Group, which owns Iberia, British, whatever. Lufthansa owns virtually everything else. And what isn't owned by those two is owned by KLM. There are 4 airlines left in the US. And so I don't see, I love the story and I wish it were true, but except for a relatively few segments, and Amazon is an interesting example. There's a whole theory about Amazon that says that they are not as quite consumer friendly as sometimes they come about. But this enormous consolidation of economic power in the hands of a relatively small number of companies in industry after industry strikes me that consumers may not be quite as powerful as we hope they are.
Yeah, I would just add a little note of skepticism as well in that I wrote an article a few years ago about the working conditions in a big Amazon warehouse where it's the size of like 20 football pitches. I went in and looked around and interviewed a lot of people who worked there, including a man who, he was a supervisor, and he said that all of his workers would get blisters in their first few weeks at work because they were walking 20 miles a day. He found it a kind of really miserable, desperate place to work. And yet he said he was still an Amazon customer because it's so fast and so efficient that even though he felt deeply that they were treating their workers badly, he also couldn't resist using them because they were so good at what they do. And so I think that there is an inherent tension there whereby we as consumers, we might feel uncomfortable about some of these business models, but we also love the cheapness and the convenience of taking an Uber at a moment's notice. Sally, what do you think?
May I, though, suggest that there's another alliance between the consumer and the worker, and we see this in social entrepreneurship. The fair trade movement, for example, and many of these movements are contested. They're not all positive, but that idea of organizing cooperatives so that they can get access to markets, so that they can actually they can reap some of the benefits of those products, the growing consumption by first world markets through the fair trade label. One of the entrepreneurs in our portfolio is a fellow named Rupert Howes of the Marine Stewardship Council, and that story is a really interesting story because in the early 90s, the cod fisheries, the cod fishing industry collapsed off the banks of Newfoundland, and overnight, 40,000 plus fisher jobs were wiped out. I mean, it was a massive, massive collapse. Well, Unilever, which one of whose products was Gorton and the fish sticks or fish fingers, as they call them in the U.S., was at risk. Unilever and the World Wildlife Fund came together and created the Marine Stewardship Council with the idea of bringing sustainable fishing practices to the industry so that these fish stocks could be sustained obviously for business interests. Now that eco-label survives. A little digression that in fact this collaboration, interesting as it seemed, between a civil society organization and a big corporation sounded great, but until the social entrepreneur came in, it really wasn't going anywhere. But anyway, now they have over 10% of wild fisheries under the Marine Stewardship Council's sort of scientific evaluation of sustainable fishing practices. And this label is outperforming all others, and retailers like Walmart and Tesco and others are sourcing, and Whole Foods, of course, are sourcing their entire product lines of wild-caught fish with Marine Stewardship Council certification. So that's the angle for consumers who actually do not want to be agents of the exploited worker. That's their choice, and we're seeing these kinds of eco-labels and other and worker-friendly labels growing in the marketplace.
Yeah, Sally, you and Nicola both seem to be thinking of solutions to work with the world as it is, whereas Jeffrey, I almost get the sense from your presentation that you would like to go back to the world as it was. Is that fair, or do you think that can we go back to a world in which there is more traditional Fordist employment, if that's the best way? And if not, what's your proposed solution?
Well, I'm not sure that we're ever going to go back to the world as it was, nor should we probably want to. But I do believe there's probably a role, which is ironic given what's going on in the world. I think there is a role for government. Without for a nanosecond denying the importance of social entrepreneurship and the voluntary efforts that both Nikolai and Sally have talked about to organize consumers and organize people and label and so on and so forth, that will take us a certain direction, in some places farther than others, but probably really won't take us all the way. And so when you think about, it's certainly in the US, and probably actually in other countries, with which of course I'm not as familiar, when you think about what has actually helped people and their well-being, it has oftentimes been, in Germany, we heard yesterday, I think, the wonderful stories of the Mittelstand, and Germany has a co-determination law. So the idea of workers at the table is not just because some enlightened employer does something, but there's a legal framework. Nikolai already referred to the Wagner Act, which permitted the growth of labor unions. The ending of child labor in the United States probably came about more quickly because of government regulation than just having social entrepreneurs and labeling of products that don't use and exploit labor. Well, that is also still important. So I would hope that there could be some collective action to change the rules, because otherwise you always have this problem of free riding and the problem of organizing when one party benefits and one doesn't, which is part of the story of why so few companies now in the US offer health benefits, because it puts me in a cost disadvantage. So one of the things that Obamacare, which will soon be gone, tried to do is to say, you can't, you're going to have some common framework for everybody. So I think there is a role for the state, and given what's going on, I'm not optimistic, but that certainly is one piece of the solution, because social entrepreneurship will take you a certain level, the consumer organizing will take you a certain level, but I would not want to rely solely on that.
If I may, I totally agree that government has a role to play. What we're waiting for the moment is we're waiting for forward-looking politicians who are willing to look at the world as it is and can make the effort of radical imagination that is needed to create the new institutions, the equivalent of the Wagner Act in the last century or the Social Security Act. You can't replicate those programs or those rules because they don't work in a new economy such as the digital economy. There's a very interesting book published earlier this year called Sleeping Giant, and it's about a large part of the US workforce which is working in the service industry, so in restaurants, hotels, cleaning persons, and it's a workforce that we don't really see, even though we're served by them at Starbucks or McDonald's. It's a workforce that doesn't have a conscience of itself as a class or as a group with common interests. It's a workforce that is not organized, is mostly without trade unions, and is far more numerous than the old workforce that voted for Trump in the Rust Belt. And so while we keep on telling that we should preserve the way work used to be for those white-collar, for those white working class in the Rust Belt, we're forgetting that there's this new workforce rising that is in need of government intervention. And I saw Obamacare as a way to enlarge the welfare state to cover those people against new risks. Yes. But apart from Obama, I don't see anywhere in the Western world forward-looking politicians who are willing to make the radical imagination effort that is needed for the future. So.
There may be, though, there may be a new kind of agent who can work to sort of renegotiate the interests of workers and the government. And I think here of Nandan Nilekani, a great entrepreneur, a great Indian entrepreneur, who took on the challenge of the percentage of Indians who were without identity, without formal identity, and who actually was tapped by then Prime Minister Singh to initiate this idea through what was called the Unique Identifier Authority of India. And he went into government sort of as a sort of civil worker, but he applied all the principles, everything he knew from business, from the biometrics that he understood to get the identification system in place. He created enrollment centers, not just in official government sites, but throughout the society, in schools and post offices, wherever people were. And by the time he was done, in 5 years, he'd enrolled 800 million Indians in this unique identification authority. They all had their ADAR numbers, and last year the numbers went to 1 billion Indians who are now officially citizens. And this means they can access the services to which they're entitled in India. And that includes the Right to Work Act, which India has, the Rural Right to Employment Act. They can enroll their kids in school. They have access to these services, and the state gets to reduce its costs through the greater efficiencies of this system. Everybody wins. So he's not really a government agent. He's not really an entrepreneur, a business entrepreneur. He's bringing the best of both together. And I think we're going to see more and more of these kinds of people who are able to negotiate this territory between what business does best and what government does best.
Okay, we need imaginative, brilliant people who see the world as it is, and that seems like a good moment to turn to our brilliant, imaginative audience and ask them for some questions. We'll start with our Drucker Challenge discussant, and that is Kelsey Truman. If you could stick your hand up, and we'll get a microphone over. Kelsey, she's over there.
Hello, thank you so much for being here and for inviting me as well. I was wondering if any of you have case studies that would speak to solutions and best practices, especially whenever it comes to youth unemployment, forcibly displaced populations or refugees, and of course the white working class, which we also sort of touched on as well along the Rust Belt. Are there any case studies and solutions that can really guide us in addressing this precarious and vulnerable populations whenever it comes to unemployment and just general existence and access to benefits under the government and, in general, that?
Who wants to take that?
Well,
Sally, I'm looking at you.
I'll take it and say, of course. In fact, one of the entrepreneurs we're in the course of doing some diligence on right now is a fellow who works in Nigeria and who sees this incredible population of unemployed and underemployed youth in Nigeria, understands the challenge of keeping them in country, in rural environments so they don't all migrate to Lagos and create ever greater challenges in the urban centers, and has developed a program through which they can actually drive greater incomes, drive greater productivity, and actually make farming and agricultural cultivation on small plots a profitable means of earning a living and actually sustaining themselves and their families. So we see this over and over again with social entrepreneurs. They're targeting these disadvantaged populations. Youth employment in in the Middle East and in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, enormous challenges. And yes, social entrepreneurs are working on that.
I also met an entrepreneur recently who had gone in and talked to lots of people who worked in a retailer called Sports Direct in the UK, which is infamous for employing people on very insecure, so-called 0 hours contracts. And he just asked them, what do you need? What could I invent that would help you? Because he saw that this was a growing part of the population, and there was just a business case for inventing something that would help them. And they said they just don't want their incomes to fluctuate so much, that they just have no idea from week to week how much they're going to earn. So his idea, and he hasn't launched it yet, but his idea is to offer them an income smoothing service whereby they give him access to their bank accounts, if they're brave enough, and he figures out what is their average earnings, and then he will top up their earnings in the weeks when they dip below, and in the weeks when they earn a bit more, he takes it back again. So I think there are people out there, and I wouldn't even say he was a social entrepreneur, I think he wants to make money from it, but there are people who kind of see that these challenges are now big enough that it's worth doing something. Nicola?
What's interesting with the entrepreneurs, we're speaking about a very new phenomenon. It has only accelerated since the 2008 crisis with the maturity of mobile technology and the will of the consumers to find cheaper products because we're in a crisis after all. And so it's rather new, and we shouldn't be surprised that there are not yet a lot of convincing cases that prove that we can solve all the problems. But the magic of entrepreneurship is that entrepreneurs usually don't wait for the government to intervene and to have new ideas. They try to solve the problems among themselves. So entrepreneurs will enter the market to solve problems created by other entrepreneurs. And so I can recommend a very interesting book written by Nick Grossman and Elizabeth Voigt. It's been published by O'Reilly Media in the US, and the title is Serving Workers in the Gig Economy, and it provides you with a comprehensive list of startups that are dedicated to improve the daily life of those workers in the gig economy. They are not waiting, once again, for the government to do something, especially in the US where the government doesn't do many things because of the gridlock in Washington, D.C. And so they're not waiting, and they're imagining new insurance products, new banking products, such as the one mentioned by Sarah. And we don't really know if they will prosper over the long term. But social history, once again, teaches us that before the government mandates one program for the entire population, there were in fact a lot of experiments on the ground. So I'm not sure about the Anglo-Saxon world, but in France we call them the mutuelles. The mutuelles were social insurance, before social insurance was a government program. They were organized for all the workers in one factory or all the farmers on a certain territory. And those people didn't wait for the government to cover their risks and to improve their lives. Only if you don't have the mandate of the government, it can only work as far as small populations on certain territories and not for the entire workforce. But it's a lot of progress anyway.
Great, let's have some more questions. Any hands up? Oh, lots, okay. What I might do is just take groups of 3. So there's a gentleman here, and there's a woman there in a reddish dress, and then there's a man back there, yeah.
Thank you. I'm Pranjal Kalra, I'm one of the challenge finalists, and my question is on the debate that Jeff and Nicholas were having about how in industries, in some sectors like the airlines and healthcare, there are not so much power to the consumers and the workers, and they're just facing a backbite of whatever the industries or the sectors are doing. So how can we bring more power in specific sectors like healthcare and airlines that affect the masses back to the consumers and the workers? And how can governments and institutions and public play a role in this?
Great, that's an excellent question, thank you. And yes, the lady there.
Hi, I'm also a Drucker Challenge finalist, and I guess my question is: at the moment, you see the gig economy being kind of all the salaries are getting lower and lower. But do you think that knowledge workers are also the lower level knowledge workers are also at risk of that happening with automation and technology becoming really big? And how does that impact, I guess, the stability of a career for the future?
Thank you. Very good question. Yes, and then there's a man there in a red tie.
I'm a little bit disappointed, not of the Drucker Forum, but of the state of society, because years ago we had a discussion, it was called creative capitalism. Bill Gates and Warren Buffett invented a concept to rescue the world, and mainly they stated, or they had the conviction, or they were convinced that through reputation and through a customer who forces the companies to look on their reputation, we will cure capitalism. And if we look now at our situation, the situation even becomes worse. And I think in their theory, one thing was missing. Yeah. We have to have a collaborative and an organized customer in order to improve really the situation. Manuel Castells, for example, he said, the mechanism of power is a double one. We have on the one side people who are organized, and on the other side we have the masses who are not organized. And if we don't change this, I think Trump will not be the first and last problem we have. I think populism will misuse this. And so my question is, how can we make this creative capitalism, perhaps through better collaboration, work?
Excellent. Very good questions. Thank you very much, everyone. So does anyone here want to kind of chip in on any of those three?
Well, so on the first question, I think, most countries have antitrust laws. Decades ago, all the countries, to some more than others, have stopped enforcing them, which is ironic, because even the most conservative economists believe in market competition, but they don't really do anything to ensure that the markets remain competitive. On the second question, I would say yes. The de-skilling of work is coming to the highest paid professions. As my wife is fond of saying, thank God you're as old as you are. We haven't quite automated me, but we have but certainly you can see news articles that are now produced, particularly press releases of earnings. If you go on your computer screen, it will say this article was written by some, robotic thing. The last time I looked, the largest outsourcing in India was the outsourcing of legal work. If you think of what much legal work is, it is reading and text processing. This eventually will become quite automated. We've automated. There are now robots that do operations, obviously under the guidance of a doctor. Someday the doctor may not need to be there. Planes are essentially already automated. The day will quickly come when you don't actually need the pilot to turn the computer on and off, which is pretty much all they do. And so yes, I think the automation and the compression of wages is going on pretty much everywhere.
Just on the white collar automation question, I very bravely, or maybe you would say foolishly, agreed to do a battle with an artificial intelligence journalism robot a few months ago, where we were both issued with the UK employment data one month. It comes out at 9:30, and I and the AI was called Emma, so Emma and we both went away and feverishly wrote articles digesting this data and writing what it meant. She filed her article in 12 minutes. And it was quite good. It really was quite good. She had context in there. She knew that the Brexit vote was coming up, and this might have an effect on the numbers. So it took me about half an hour to do mine. So I did feel a bit threatened, but the one thing that kind of comforted me was that she was very good on the accuracy, but she didn't really have any judgment. And so I thought to myself, well, maybe in this new world, we can have AIs that automate the more boring bits of our jobs, and then that might free us up to spend more time doing the fun bits, the creative bits, the imaginative bits. Fingers crossed. That's my experience of it.
Yes. So about the white-collar workers or knowledge workers, we were duped in a way in the 90s by a lot of left-wing politicians who explained to us that yes, we should be resigned to the fact that blue-collar jobs in factories were about to disappear, but we should all go back to school to learn knowledge work and turn into engineers or designers or whatever. And nobody really ever knew what that was all about, because it was false, in fact. The knowledge economy is an economy where knowledge is commoditized, which means that we don't really need knowledge workers anymore. And what we're seeing as of today in the rising digital economy is that, in fact, most jobs in the future will be serving other people in usually in direct contact, so in restaurants, hotels, taking care of older people, childcare, etc., nurses and doctors, but with a lot of empathy, with a lot of listening, with a lot of talking, with a lot of emotion going back and forth between two different people. And so that's where the jobs of tomorrow are, except that they appear in business models that are usually incompatible with existing legal framework, which leads me to the first question and the airlines and the pharmaceutical. What's at stake here is, can the government, instead of protecting the old way of producing and consuming in certain industry, therefore making it more difficult for entrepreneurial ventures to enter the market, can the government help those ventures disrupt the market and force an evolution of the legal framework so as to be able to finally create those jobs that we desperately need? So you see, it's a system once again. And so far, the governments have been very bad at this, and that's why I talked about forward-looking politicians. So far, government has been more prone to defend the traditional hotel industry against Airbnb, or the traditional taxi industry against Uber, or traditional healthcare system against new ways to take care of people and cure them when they're ill, when they're sick. So this is why we need forward-looking politicians who, instead of protecting established corporations, will pave the way for new corporations to rise and create the jobs that we can create if only the legal framework enables it.
Yeah, right. Sorry, we have a red flashing clock that says we have 2 minutes left. How about we each sum up with a kind of 20-second, what is the one thing, maybe to address that final gentleman's question, what is the one thing that we need to try and do to make sure that capitalism continues to work for everyone in the digital economy? Jeff, do you want to start?
Well, I agree with Nicholas completely. And so the technology that I would urge you to invent is one that produces forward-looking politicians. And for that matter, a technology that produces much more humane business leaders.
Excellent. Sally?
Maybe I just build on the comment about creative capitalism and say I think we're in dire need of conscientious capitalism, and that conscientious capitalism will harness the goodness in people and show us the way toward a more enlightened future for everyone.
Great, thank you. And
well, I'd like to answer the third question. We're living a world where there's a mass and small organized groups. With digital technology, the mass is made of individuals that can express their particular needs and that who can connect one with another, therefore harnessing the power of networks. And so that's why I wrote a book a few years ago, and we call the book, it's not been translated in English, but The Age of the Multitude. The mass is turning into a multitude. The multitude is made of individuals that are very different, that are all very demanding, but that are seeding that alliance among themselves through networks to make their demands heard by the powerful and the few.
Great. Well, with that, can we please say thank you to all of the panelists?